This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, kicks off the show with a cattle market outlook. He talks about things taking place globally that can impact the market and provides an update on the meat demand monitor. Keeping the show rolling is K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth with an update on pests in fields. He talks about alfalfa weevils, pea aphids, and what growers should be watching for in their fields moving forward. Information about snakes from K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts in today's show as he explains why people will start seeing them more often and how they can end up in homes. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update. And this week we're joined by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Glynn, starting our cattle market conversation with what is cash cattle markets looking like?
Yeah, this past week was fairly calm, and particularly calm given some things that are going on in the world. So calm can be good is what my opening comment would be. But AMS called the fed cattle market cash 5 area on Friday at 184. They called the feeder cattle market, and I'm going to reference Pratt here, mixed. It was a little bit more all over the board, so mixed probably understates it. There were several lots of 5 even $10 a hundredweight down, and then there were several the opposite direction. So mix might cover it, but there's a lot of variability depending on what weight class we're talking about. The 2 lots I noted, again, this is for Pratt this past week, was 161 head weighing 876 pounds, came in at 240. And then a little bit heavier lot, 177 head weighing 972, came in at 225. Those both will be a little bit softer examples compared to the week before. When we flip it over to the board, CME futures closed Friday. June live cattle a little bit below 172, down just 50 cents for the week. I'll interject here. I was actually pleasantly surprised that the June live cattle and more generally all live cattle weren't down more as the week closed. As I'll talk a minute about Middle East, but lots of the equity markets and markets in general were taking a hit. May feeder cattle closed at 234 and change, down about $4 for the week. And then to kind of wrap out what was going on in the markets here, box beef was up a little on the week, not a lot. Choice was up $3, so we closed right at 300 versus 297 the Friday before. And then select was up $1, so 296 this Friday versus 295 the week before.
And Glenn, you've mentioned the Middle East a few times, and why is that something important for the cattle market?
Yeah, and for context here, I'm not a geopolitical expert, and most of our listeners aren't either. But we truly are in a global world in any sense of the word. And our markets, whether that's the stock market, equity markets, commodity markets, whatever, are more intertwined than ever before. And in many ways, that's good, right? And I'm going to importantly reference here for our beef cattle listeners, we export a higher value of our production we ever have before. We do that in part because we have a globally connected economy. So we got to keep all that in mind. But the events I'm referencing are, elevated stress, I'll just say it, between Israel and Iran, the subsequent moves by other partners on both sides of that. The biggest one is unknown whether that war, battle, pending battle, whatever I'm supposed to call that there, is going to escalate or not. The human social aspect of that, obviously, I hope we don't see that. We tend to see the oil market respond most when something goes on in the Middle East because it is one of the key, production regions. And it's key for a transportation. There's a lot of things that go through the Suez Canal from a logistical aspect as well, which is in that region. So what happens there has a lot of implications, is the point. It might feel like it's 42 degrees away from the U.S. cattle market, and it is a couple degrees away from it, but it's not 42 degrees, is why I interject that here. And just being human, I hope we see things calm down as well.
So something just to keep an eye on for cattle producers.
Yes, and you and I are doing this very early on Monday morning. It definitely is one of the wild cards coming into this coming week for the markets as well.
And something else wanting to mention to cattle producers is that the USDA isn't releasing the July cattle inventory report.
Yeah, so to set the stage for this, most of the listeners probably know that in most years, USDA NASS releases a January and a July cattle inventory report. And for geeks like me and my partners that are on every week with you, those give us detailed supply insights, like state-by-state level insight, how many animals are on feed, that augment things like the cattle on feed that's monthly and so forth. And I don't want to break the report down any more than that. But this particular announcement is frustrating for some of the cattle industry because we're in the midst of, I would call it, elevated interest and uncertainty about if and when we're going to pull the trigger on herd expansion. And these January and July cattle inventory reports are very helpful snapshots of if we're doing that or not. And the recent announcement by USDA that we're not going to get that July report is frustrating, and that's come across my desk in several ways. So I want to highlight this for those that haven't heard it, but I also want to put kind of a broader bow around this for a moment. Is USDA, like any other group, faces budget challenges. And while I also don't like the announcement, I understand why NASS had to make some of the adjustments they did. And my plea would be that, listeners that share this concern and so forth, that we find a way to a little bit more proactively and productively examine what, in this case, USDA products are most valuable. And we could, I highlight that. And there's probably some that are comparatively less valuable that maybe need to be the ones that are considered when, budgets get tight and we have to either cease efforts or shrink the reports or those kind of things, because budget realities are exactly that, the realities. And if that was done in a proactive and sort of bipartisan way is what I'm thinking about here, I think the outcomes could be better, is the point. Myself and Ross Pruitt's a colleague that's now at University of Tennessee Martin. He used to be at LSU, and over a dozen years ago, we had a small research project looking at the value of USDA reports, kind of forced livestock and crop producers to tell us which reports they've deemed the most and least important. That kind of work is what's on my mind here. I'm personally not looking for more to do here. It's not the point of that comment. But if we did some of that proactively before these forced cuts were there, my gut tells me we'd make more strategic and targeted adjustments, and all players involved would probably be better off. So I hope your listeners benefit from that announcement and then the subsequent thinking about how we can make the situation better.
So there will still be other reports from the USDA, just not the cattle inventory report.
Yes. The most recent announcement this past week is that and some county level things that will not be reported. And again, this is USDA NASS. I'm not mad at them. Hopefully nobody took the tone there. And it's not the first time. The July cattle inventory has been skipped in some past years as well. It creates challenges. You can't do year over year. You got to fill in the blank or skip a year as an analyst, those kind of things. And USDA knows that. I mean, they're not trying to make a problem here, I don't believe. I'm just, announcing it so our listeners know, and then secondly, hoping we can have kind of more proactive and collective efforts to make these things better going forward.
And Glynn, wanting to talk about your meat demand monitor now, and first off, thinking about the willingness to pay.
We're talking here middle of April. I'm referencing the March report, which again is on our AgManager.info website. The good news for the industry would be is retail demand. So go to the grocery store for consumption at home was up on 5 of the 8 products we examined in March compared to February. And actually several cases where it was up compared to March of 2023, which is good. Specifically, ground beef was up, pork chops down slightly, bacon a little bit off, chicken breast up. I mean, you go down the line here. They're not major changes, but retail demand appears to be holding up pretty well is what I would highlight there. Food service demand, however, was actually up on all examined, maybe reversing a pattern. And please note, I emphasize maybe because there's a tone in my voice here, is there's other evidence that food service demand is still soft. I hope the March MDM is the right one and not kind of the outlier that was wrong for a month. But as we've started here 2024, retail demand has been okay. Food service been a little softer. Cost of a meal have reflected elevated labor costs and other things. And more households concerned about their budget have just consumed more at home, and demand's been higher for at home. I hope March proves to be a turning point in that narrative, but hopefully you could tell from the tone of my voice is we don't quite know yet.
And also always wanting to mention what you're seeing as the most important when it comes to purchasing protein for your typical resident.
Yeah, so the way we measure that in the MDM is called protein values. So we give them a list of 12 things like taste, safety, price, all the way to like environmental impact, and ask what are the 4 of these 12 that are most important when you're making a protein purchasing decision, and what are the 4 that are least important, and of course the 4 you don't pick are intermediate. So I have this forced rank exercise, and we do that, Shelby, so that you can't tell me all 12 are the most important thing in your life, because that's forced trade-offs tell us more. And again, we continue to see that for the average person, like thinking across all people in the country, in March, taste, freshness, safety, and price remain the 4 most important. More directly, they are the ones most often in the bucket, the top 4 bucket. Conversely, things like environmental impact, origin traceability, animal welfare, use of hormones and antibiotics rank quite lower. What you're turning to here to highlight for our listeners is in March, and we've done this a couple other times during the MDM, we broke that down by generation. So I just gave kind of the national summary, and there was not a big change from the past month. Those are very stable. But when you break it down by generation, you see differences. And these also aren't surprising. But I bring this just to remind our listeners that we have a lot of variation in our population, one of which is generational. And the simple summary here would be is the baby boomer generation, which, to remind our listeners, and some of which are probably our baby boomers, are ones that were born between 1946 and 1964. That particular group places more priority on taste, freshness, and price compared to the younger generations. And at the other extreme here, the millennial generation, which are the ones born between 1981 and 1996, which would be the younger listeners that are out there, and I'm sure we have some of those on as well. They have what looks like a flatter line on the chart you and I are looking at, these relative scores. And while they still obviously care about taste and freshness and price, and in fact those still are the top determinants, comparatively they don't trump other things that I call social issues nearly as strong for millennials. So flip that on its head, things like environmental impact, animal welfare, those kind of things that I listed earlier rank higher for millennial generation than they do for the older baby boomer generation. The implication of this, of course, is target marketing things that have an environmental impact claim or an animal welfare claim or those kind of things are probably going to be more fruitful, all else equal, for the millennial generation. And you better not mess up taste and freshness and price for anybody is a kind of way to put a bow around that. So the order of importance doesn't change across generation, but the relative importance does. And relative to price is an important part of this. I'm going to save your listeners from really geeking that out, but you can take any of the 11 that aren't price and compare them to the importance of price, and you basically back into what you and I would call like a willingness to pay or willingness to trade off a non-price thing like an animal welfare claim with price. And millennials in particular tend to be more willing to do that for things like animal welfare in that example I gave you than the older generation. Nothing really surprising there, but I find it helpful to periodically interject in these reports, mainly just to remind the MDM report reviewers and information reviewers of that source of diversity in our country.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show talking about pests and alfalfa. And in to talk about it, we're joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, we recently talked about alfalfa weevils, but wanting to give an update on where we're at now with them.
Yes. It's that time of year, and I think I've stressed that I do not like alfalfa weevils just because of the timing when they actually affect alfalfa and the weather that we have in Kansas. And this year has really been a strange year weather-wise. I mean, we normally have strange weather, especially in spring, the end of the winter, early spring, right? But this year, this is the second year in a row, and a lot of the stakeholders, a lot of the producers, we've talked about this in the last 2 or 3 weeks. This is the second year in a row we've had really dry conditions around, at least the north-central part of the state and in other parts. But because of that, the alfalfa just hasn't been growing the way it used to do, 2 or 3 years ago, or when we used to get moisture in a timely fashion. So when I talk about pests, I'm also talking the impact that, warmer than normal temperatures and drought has on the pests and the plants also. But as far as alfalfa weevils go, I've been out this past week, last week, sampling a lot of different fields, some that were already treated a week or two ago, some that have yet to be treated. But all cases around north central Kansas, at least, they need moisture, and there's nothing we can do about that. But the weevils are really affecting, it seems to me, the stands. One of the reasons, like I said, the plants aren't growing very much. Usually this time of year, the stems are 7 to 8 inches long, and right now they're probably 4 to 5 and struggling. So any chewing we have by alfalfa weevils is going to affect the plant just that much more. But the fields that were treated 2 weeks ago seem to be holding pretty good. The treatment seems to have worked pretty well so far. Now, we've stressed this year using enough gallonage to make sure you cover the foliage adequately. That's really important because these insecticides that are labeled for alfalfa weevils and most insect pests are contact insecticides, which means they have to contact the pest in order to control them. So when there's not a lot of foliage, a lot of that, the gallonage may be going to the ground and may be wasted. At least that's what a lot of the growers think. But still, you got to get adequate coverage of the plant. So, use your good judgment, but 10 to 15 gallons per acre is generally what we recommend as far as gallonage or water carrier goes for the insecticide. Now, the first treatments that I've looked at and the first treatments that I've heard about so far have worked pretty well. I'm hoping that holds up. But some of the fields I was in last week that have not been treated yet, the larval instars are all pretty much about second instars. There's a few small ones, first instars. But what that means, generally speaking, there are 3 instars. This is the developmental stage of the alfalfa weevils. So what that means, there's probably going to be about another 7 to 10 days of feeding by these weevils on the foliage. Now, again, that's temperature dependent. And it looks to me like temperatures are going to be, 40 to 70 degrees. That's ideal for alfalfa weevil development. So it looks to me like, for the most part, there's going to be at least another 7 to 10 days of feeding. So keep that in mind. So if you're thinking about retreating your field, or if you're thinking about treating it for the first time, you got about that much time left on damage potential for alfalfa weevils. Along that lines, they feed more the larger they get, up to a point when they're like late third instars. Then they start, crawling down into the foliage, down to the ground, and start preparing a puparium. And then if you're out in your fields and you're seeing a bunch of, they've been described as cotton-looking balls out in the field, they're just silken little nests or little cocoons. Those are alfalfa weevil pupal cases. So the alfalfa weevil's pupating. At that point in time, it doesn't do any good to spray. The pupal case, for the most part, is impervious to water, so it's just going to shed the water off, which means it's not going to get the insecticide into where the weevil is inside. And besides that, when the adults come out, I get a lot of questions about adult feeding. Adults feed a little bit, but not like the larvae do. So even though they may come out, they may hang around for a while. They may do what we call barking on the stems, which means they just chew a little bit around the stems. They may cause a few little pinprick-sized holes in leaves, but for the most part, they're not going to cause any yield reduction or any impact on yield. They're mainly concerned with coming out, and then they're going to be mating, and then they're going to be leaving as soon as the temperatures get over 80, 85 degrees, or as soon as that first swathing goes down. And that opens up the field, and then all the adults leave. They go away. They don't stay in the fields. They don't feed. They go someplace else where they oversummer and wait and come back in the fall to start mating and laying eggs again. But we still have about, from what I've seen around north central Kansas, we have about another probably 7 to 10 days of major feeding. If you haven't sprayed yet, keep that in mind. Otherwise, after that, you should start seeing the little white silk balls in your field, which means they're pupating. And again, at that point in time, we do not recommend treating because the adults aren't going to do any damage. Most of the feeding's over with, and they're just going to be waiting to leave the fields.
And as those alfalfa weevils are kind of on their way out almost, are we concerned about aphids making their way in?
That's exactly right. One thing I need to talk about also about if you have treated your field and you want to go back out and monitor, which we recommend, go back out and make sure they're not coming back because some eggs are still in the stems. You need to look at the REI, the reentry interval on the label of whatever insecticide you used. That tells you how long a period between application and when it's safe to go back into the fields. And it's different for all the different products. So make sure whatever you used, you look at the REI. And then if you're going to harvest, make sure you look at the pre-harvest interval, the PHI. So, but yes, you're right. All of the treatments for alfalfa weevils have done a pretty good number on lady beetles and other beneficial insects also that help hold down aphids. So the fields I've been in last week, I'm starting to see pea aphid populations come back up a little bit. I haven't seen any yet that I would worry about, but over the next week or 2 weeks, there's not much out there to, stop them from proliferating in the field. So I'm guessing as the pea aphids come in, and remember they're aphids, so they're all females. So they're all just producing females, and as those females become mature, they produce females. And so those populations can build up a lot faster than other insect populations. Generally, we have pretty good populations of beneficials to help control them, green lacewings and lady beetles and some of the parasitoids. But after you've sprayed for alfalfa weevils, that's taking care of those. And it will take those beneficial insects longer to build up than it does for the aphids. So just keep in mind the aphid populations will build up. We generally don't recommend treating them. Again, this year it's dry. If it stays dry and these aphid populations build up, they're sucking the juice out of the plant. So if they're really competing with those plants for water or for moisture, you may have to consider, a P-aphid treatment. But again, it takes 50 or more per stem before I would even consider treating just for P-aphids. Plus, if you look at the plants, if the plant's starting to wilt or starting to turn yellow, that might be an indication. But again, not just a plant here or there. That's the majority of the field before you consider treating for P-aphids. But that's just kind of a heads up because of where we are right now with the alfalfa fields, at least in the north central part of the state.
Is there anything else that producers need to be out scouting their fields for?
Well, I've gotten a call or two about army cutworms. Army cutworms are in wheat, and they can also be in alfalfa. Generally, you don't notice them in alfalfa because of the stand. You got a big, thick stand of alfalfa, so they don't bother it as much. But in wheat, again, this year's been pretty dry. So if you have a thin stand of wheat, oftentimes the growers are out looking, and they call it the stands are going backwards. They're losing the stand, or it's getting thinner. If you go out and look and dig in the soil, oftentimes you'll find these right now, this time of year in mid-April, you'll find these about half-grown little larvae. They're kind of a dusky color. They're right in the soil, right around the base of the plant. They feed above ground, so they won't cut the plant, but they will chew the foliage off. Those are army cutworms. Or another good way to tell is if you see birds. Birds like to feed on army cutworms. They are great at finding population of army cutworms, as are skunks. I've followed skunks. Now, I wouldn't get too close, but I have followed skunks out in the field where they're digging in wheat fields, and you'll find army cutworms because turkeys, birds, skunks, all kinds of stuff like to feed on army cutworms. So that's something to keep in mind. That is the insect that turns into what they call the miller moth that we had such a problem with in different parts of the state. I shouldn't say a problem, such a nuisance in different parts of the state last year. Those will be coming out probably around Memorial Weekend. It seems like the army cutworm turns into the moth like the week before Memorial Weekend, right out there. Then they all head to the Colorado mountains for oversummering. But they can be a nuisance for a while during that time of year. They were in south central Kansas. So keep that in mind. Other than that, we're pretty good to go right now, I think, as far as we're kind of in between insects. One thing you might look for in wheat also is chinch bugs. Chinch bugs move out of overwintering. They move into wheat. Generally, if you have a weak stand of wheat, they will show up if you're out looking because, again, they're sucking the juice out of the plant also. But the adults don't cause as much damage as the nymphs or the immatures. But be out looking in those weak areas or the thin spots in a wheat field to see what insects or what pests are actually causing that, if there are any.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to give us an update on insects in Kansas.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about snakes with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Drew, first, some general information about snakes.
Yeah, there's 42 species in Kansas. Only 7 of those species are venomous, and one of the venomous species hasn't been detected in Kansas in about 30 years. So the point behind all that is, most of the snakes that people see, encounter in some way are going to be a non-venomous species that has a lot of benefits for us. Their prey is typically going to be things like rats and mice, and a lot of them eat insects. We have species that eat other snakes, including venomous snakes, and so that's another benefit that they can provide. It's important to be able to identify snakes so that if you see one, you know whether or not it's one that you should be scared of. I know a lot of people have that innate fear of snakes, and if you can't identify snakes, then the best thing to do is to give all snakes a lot of space. One of the really surprising statistics, I think, for a lot of people is that half of all people who were bitten by a venomous snake were actually handling that snake. So it's a lot less common to have a negative encounter with the snake if you just turn around and walk the other way when you find one.
And thinking of encounters, right now people are starting to see them a bit more?
They are. So snakes are coming out of hibernation, and when they do that, they get pretty active. They're hungry. They need to eat. They're also, poking around and exploring. And when that happens, they end up inside buildings, inside homes, and those sorts of things. And that's when I get a lot of excited phone calls and emails from folks about seeing snakes in places maybe where they didn't want to see them.
And how are those snakes getting into homes?
Well, snakes can get in through pretty small spaces, and that's one of the big challenges around snakes is, even a fairly large snake could get through a space. They can flatten their body out, and so, a half inch tall by an inch or two wide is a space that even a pretty big snake could get through. If we're thinking about an older home, especially an old farmhouse that's got a rock foundation, there's lots and lots and lots of spaces like that in the house, in between the house, gaps between the house and the foundation and that sort of thing where a snake could get in. Sliding glass doors are another common point of entry. If we've got a garage door in an attached garage, and then the door seal between the door going from the house out to the garage is not super tight, snakes can get underneath those kind of spaces too. And oftentimes once they get in the house, then they kind of start following structure, and so they'll follow walls as they move around through the house.
How might people want to, per se, trap that snake then?
Sure. Once they're in the house, really the best way to remove them, if you're confident in identifying them and know that you're not handling a venomous snake, you could, of course, catch it. And typically the way to do that would be to take an object and pin that snake's head down, grab it sort of by the neck right behind the head, firmly hold it till you get outside, and then turn it loose. For those of you who are more snake averse and don't want to try and handle a snake, or if you can't identify snakes well, we can place the large glue traps. And when you're buying these, it's important to get the ones that say large glue trap or say 4 snakes on them. We can place those up against the wall in the house. And so once the snakes get in the house, then as they move along that structure that the wall provides, those glue traps can catch them. And if we have pets inside the house that we don't want to expose to a glue trap, then putting those glue traps against the wall behind furniture, could be a couch, it could be a desk, it could be a washing machine or something like that if a pantry is a place where we're finding snakes. But using that sort of strategy of getting them caught once they get in there, if we've got a consistent issue with snakes in the house, can be really important.
Maybe also people wanting to think about things they might have around their home that are attracting snakes.
Sure. We often contribute to the problem when we've got critters like this that we don't want around. And really the thing to think about is, what do we have in the yard that might be snake habitat? So rocks or even like landscaping pavers that snakes can get under are good snake habitats, or brush piles of building material. Even tall vegetation can be snake habitat. So if we can keep that yard mowed short, not get an accumulation of weeds, and kind of clean up any clutter that we have out there, that can really help.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and talk about snakes.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.